I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet tonight and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this was and always will be Aboriginal land. On behalf of Text Publishing, I'd like to welcome you all to the launch at long last. Suzanne's wonderful novel, The Tulip Tree. It's been COVID cancelled so many times this launch, so it's marvellous to be together to launch a book. Books are written for the most part in isolation, so I think it's very important to celebrate the launch into the world of readers. Thank you to publicist extraordinaire Maddie Rebecki for organising tonight. Thank you to the all-important booksellers, Kate at Thesaurus Books, and to our musicians and caterers. Not wishing to take the spotlight off the writer, I would like to pay special homage tonight to the star of the book, Suzanne's husband, Stan. His father's story, as told to Suzanne by Stan and as transcribed by Stan from his uncle's diary, was the origin for the Tulip Tree. I know how much this book means to Stan, and I'm sure he's immensely proud of Suzanne for writing such an important and moving novel. Thank you, Stan. Working with Suzanne was a joy. Above all, she's a true writer. She has an ear for a sentence and the perfect combination of imagination and a sharp intelligence. I already had the pleasure of editing Suzanne's first novel, The Lost Child, an unacknowledged Australian classic. Everyone I know who has read it has been bowled over by its grace and power. And during the editing of The Tulip Tree, Suzanne and I had many interesting discussions on all sorts of issues. When you read the novel, if you haven't already, which you should, you'll see how intelligently she handles certain subjects without ever shying away from them. And you'll also be swept away by a truly wonderful story about a family's loves and losses during a tumultuous period in Polish history. And it always seems to me to be a tumultuous period in Polish history. At the moment. If you want to get an excellent introduction to the Tulip Tree, I do recommend that you watch on YouTube the interview that Jane Sullivan, whom you probably all know, who is here tonight. She's a highly respected literary journalist and novelist, and she has done this great interview with Suzanne, in which Suzanne talks eloquently about the lessons in writing that she learnt doing this novel, and she talks about the idea of examining secrets, something that imbues her writing process. And Jane very interestingly points out the fascinating way that Suzanne approaches her characters' moral dilemmas. But I will leave it to our launcher to talk more about the novel, Tim Costello. I've always felt a bond with Tim because 1955 is a very good year to be born. But seriously, as you no doubt agree, Tim has provided a role model for so many people through his work in the areas of social justice, gun control, gambling, global poverty, as a church minister and with World Vision, and in his writing. His best-selling books include Hope, Faith, Streets of Hope, Tips from a Travelling Soul Searcher, and most recently his memoir, A Lot with a Little. He has won many awards. He was made an Officer of the Order of Australia in 2005, and he was Australian of the Year in 2006. He was also voted a National Living Treasure. I always laugh at that award, but you are. And we are, as a community, immensely grateful to you, Tim. The stories and topics in Suzanne's novel are both personal and profound, universal and relevant in so many ways, particularly when it comes to men trying to be good men, something I imagine is dear to Tim's heart. And I'm very curious to hear what Tim, as I understand he's a brother, thought of the two main characters in Suzanne's novel, the two brothers Henrik and Adi, and their rivalrous loving relationship. Thank you, Tim, for coming tonight to launch The Tulip Tree.
Well, thank you for that introduction. It's a delight to be here, and I love this novel. And congratulations, Suzanne. I really want to say that though I read this book a long time ago now, 3 attempts to try and launch it, and I confess I haven't gone back and revisited it, but at the time it had quite a profound impact on me, and I want to describe that really with three points. The points are witness, the points are betrayal and forgiveness, and the third point is the sense of, what is it the sense of? I better look at my notes. Oh yeah, sibling rivalry. How did I forget that? Clearly, a Freudian mental block. So, when it comes to witness, some of you will know that the word witness in English comes from the Greek word martyrios. We get martyr. And the first witnesses often, it cost their lives because of what they saw, the truth they told, the suffering they experienced. They had to be eliminated. And when you think of the witness that is in this book, though a novel and fiction about the historical experience of the Poles and what they went through and what they saw and who spoke up and which sides they took, there are many, many martyrs. Polish history is virtually impossible to follow. In 1919 there was a Polish-Ukrainian war, and there's some Ukrainian scenes in the book. Then in 1919 there was the Greater Polish Uprising. Then in 1919 there was the Polish-Czech War that erupted. February 14th, 1919, the Soviet-Polish War begins. Then there's the Treaty of Versailles, which says Poland is a sovereign state, and you think maybe it will go smoothly from now on. There's the miracle of Vistula in August 1920, during the Bolshevik invasion of Poland. Then in 1920 there's a Polish-Lithuanian War. February 1921, the signing of the Franco-Polish alliance. 1921, the Peace of Riga. Lenin concludes with Polish. It ends the Polish-Soviet War. 1932, if we jump forward, and these are all the periods in the book, by the way. The signing of the Soviet-Polish non-aggression pact. Not that that did much lasting good. Then in 1934, the German-Polish non-aggression pact. Not that that did much good. 1938, the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact, which actually really is just going to partition Poland and devour it again. The 23rd of August, that was 1939, and then the 1st of September 1939, the German invasion of Poland, and the beginning, really, of the hostilities of the First World War. So Poland is really at the centre of impossible labyrinthal complexes, and in some ways reading this book forced me, Suzanne, to go back and say, what's going on in Poland? How does this all piece together? Why is it important to witness to this story? And you've done that in a really powerful way with the tale of two brothers. It's a witness in another sense. It's a witness that is very, very personal, and you've told that story of a young man escaping communist Poland, sailing a kayak across the Baltic to Sweden. Welcome, because boat people were in those days. And after working in steel factories in north of Sweden and merchant navy, he ends up in Australia, meeting and marrying. And how years into the marriage, her husband receives a copy of his uncle's diary, hardbound in blue, well worn on the corners, translated snippets from 170 densely typed pages, tapped out on an old Olivetti or Remington. And with your husband translating, you start to piece together, as a witness, a personal story against the massive backdrop of just the macro picture of the Polish central suffering of so many wars leading to the triggering of the First World War. And in translating that diary, hearing about who you call Adi and Henrik, not their names, you know the real names, a diary written in the 1970s, and you falling back to the core question, how has this ordinary family survived such extraordinary times? How does any family survive such times? So this novel is a witness. It's a witness to otherwise suffering that is sort of too complex for Antipodean Australians. Happened over there, so many wars, who can piece it together. And a family saga set in the darkest times about the struggle to love, about courage to go on. So, thank you for this book being a witness. Secondly, this book is a profound book about betrayal and forgiveness. It's almost as if, and we've seen a bit of this in the pandemic, we have seen, because no one alive today has lived through a global pandemic, and there's a heap of people struggling to accept there is a global pandemic, struggling to come to terms with the loss of freedoms which inevitably follow a global pandemic or war or a disaster. Whether there are, in disaster times like war ethics. And how do humans modulate what is their ethical frame to survive, to make certain compromises they may say are unacceptable in peace times? How does a war ethic or a pandemic ethic actually lead you to think through from, I would never do this, but for this situation, what is required of me? The war ethics really are around betrayal and forgiveness, and the forgiveness bit is really interesting for me. It sent my mind off in directions. Is it possible to forgive before the person who is the perpetrator has apologised or repented or said sorry? Does apology and repentance come first and only then forgiveness, or is forgiveness possible before even? Are some people just naturally good at forgiving? And that's why it's easy for them? Or is it actually that we're all really find it hard to forgive, particularly given the depth of the wounds? What is betrayal and forgiveness? What does it mean for me? Pertinent for me, my mother, who's 92, is in the last end of stages of life. She probably won't make it till Christmas. She's not eating, she's on oxygen, her mind is still very good. Last Thursday when I was with her, I said, Mum, any loose ends, any conversations you need to have. And then I said, anyone, Mum, you need to forgive. And she looked at me. She said, no, Tim, that's all done. And it was quite a sense of closure for me. She has done the work of forgiving. Now, if you knew my mum, you'd know she has a few enemies. She's made a few. Forgiveness is actually pretty important at this end of life if you're going to die well. This book raises profound questions about forgiveness, about witness, and of course it raises questions about sibling rivalry. Henrik reached out to embrace him formally, awkwardly. How rarely they touched since childhood, thought Adi, as he sank against his brother. How clumsy their love. Brothers Henrik and Adam Radecki's relationship is one of fraught love and jealousy. Henrik, unhappily married, becomes a rich and successful industrialist, while Adi, a devoted vet, finds and loses love. Their bond is tested throughout their lives from the 1920s against the background of Poland's tragic and tumultuous relationship with Russia, Ukraine, and everyone else actually. Through war, revolution, invasion, until 1954 in the snowy mountains of Australia. Adi's wife and son are at the heart of this riveting tale in which family secrets threaten to tear lives apart, caught up in momentous events. Each character reminds us of our power to survive extraordinary times, of the moral choices we make, of the dramatic turns our lives can take. Well, it is very dramatic, and those issues, without spoiling the plot of forgiveness and betrayal, are very deep between the brothers. Very deep. I was a bit taken aback when years back Annie Rayson wrote a play called Two Brothers. I went to see it, my brother didn't. Funnily enough, I came out pretty well in the play, my brother didn't. But it's interesting to me that Freud said conflict and violence really starts with men, boys, wanting to kill their father to possess their mother's love, you know, the Oedipus complex. Actually, the Jewish scriptures, Christian Old Testament says it's a different story. Conflict and violence starts with sibling rivalry. It's Cain and Abel. It's Isaac, father of the Jews, and Ishmael, father of the Arabs. It's Joseph, sold into slavery by his brothers. It's Jacob and Esau, father of the Edomites, their brothers. But sibling rivalry is profoundly at the heart of so much conflict, of so much denial, of so much inability to rise above and forgive. So in so many ways, Tulip Tree is a powerful, powerful book. Thank you for witness. Thank you for betrayal and forgiveness being explored, and certainly for sibling rivalry. I hereby launch the book. Thank you.
Goodness, Tim. How to respond to that? It's incredibly difficult, as the writers in the room will know, to analyse your own work. And another Tim Winton, I heard say once that it's only at the very last interview that you do that you actually understand what you've written. Because this process of writing that comes out of inspiration and the unconscious is a very strange one, so that we may write the book and not really understand what we've written. There's also a saying that you, the reader, actually write the final draft in your reading. So, Tim, I am overwhelmed. You are a very good and dear reader. Thank you. You have helped me understand and see a little bit more clearly what I may have written there. And I hope that it's the inspiration that you say. Thank you so much for launching it. In an email this week, Penny talked about the launch at long last, which I think is a perfect title. You think there have been 3 or 4 attempts. In actual fact, I think there have been about 7. Published last June, and lockdown has been such a difficult time for so many people. I've seriously thought that maybe we don't need to do this after such a long time, that launching a book is maybe like a first world problem, not being able to launch it, and perhaps it doesn't matter, but look, when I see you here tonight and when I listen to Tim's words, I am thrilled that you've come. Thank you so much. Some of you have come from interstate, lots from all over Melbourne. Thank you. You may not be aware, but the incubation of a novel is much the same as a baby. It takes about 9 months from when the contract is signed with the publisher, through the editing process, the rewriting, the re-editing, the book cover design, the design of the book, in this case the inclusion of maps and family trees, and all the while during that time the sales and marketing people are connecting with bookshops and with libraries and actually selling the book before it's even been printed. There's also the saying that it takes a village to raise a child, and I'd like to use that tonight to thank people who've been very closely involved with raising my baby. Text, as a publisher, I'm just so grateful and overwhelmed that they continue to publish me. I'm very, very thankful to Michael and Penny here tonight. Penny, the ultimate midwife. I imagined with my first book that I would hand her my manuscript and she'd slash it through with red and she might even write some of the hard parts. Well, she didn't. She works very gently. Perhaps you could, or maybe that would, and off I go to work on that, because I think our minds work very well together. She's worked very hard on this book. It hasn't been a simple manuscript. 3 languages have been involved, French, Polish and German. There's been a lot of checking of facts, as she mentioned. I know how hard she's worked because her emails often came through at midnight. And I worked fairly hard too because mine went through at 5:30 in the morning to her. The endorsements on the novel are really an indication of the persistence of her standing in the publishing world. So thank you, Hetty. Lucy and Anna, Lucy is Stan's nephew. He and Anna cook us a Polish meal every Tuesday night. And over that meal we've had many discussions, and I've asked many questions about the Poland that Lucian left about 30 years ago. And he helped very much with doing the first draft of the map in the book. Thank you, Lucian. Early readers, Bev and Graham, Pauline and many other people who helped me on my way when I was starting out, thank you. My book club people are here tonight and they are the hardest markers. They have taught me that not everyone likes the same thing, and they've really toughened me up. Thank you. My writing group, I'm very, very fortunate to have belong to an inspiring group of women. Jane, Janine, Kathy, Jill and Meredith. You have really written part of this book yourselves. With very kind and constructive comments, they have made it their book too. So thank you. I was fortunate enough to have a residential fellowship at Varuna, the writing house in the Blue Mountains, where I met Michelle Smart. Our friendships, often as we get older, I think, are fairly set, but I met Michelle and we have become great friends, both in mind and spirit, and she's become such a major supporter of mine that her husband recently had to tell her that she couldn't possibly buy every copy of the book and give it away to all of her friends and every school she knew and send it overseas. And I'm sure when the sales figures come in for the Tulip Tree, there'll be a major blip in the northern beaches of Sydney. So thank you, Michelle. I'm so sorry you're not here tonight, but you are. You're in the book. As Tim said, the inspiration for this novel came from Stan's father, who was born into a Poland that was divided between Russia, Germany and Austria. He was born in the Russian sector. So when he became a vet, he was stationed on the border countries of the Caucasus and into the Altai mountains. Hearing about his life and his brother's life, I was fascinated, really. So tonight I want to acknowledge Stan's contribution to this book. Stan is not a great gift giver. A lot of stolen roses over a neighbour's fence, but I don't think there's ever been a bunch from a florist. As many of you will remember from our wedding, I commented that knowing I felt the cold, he gave me an air-cell singlet. And I obviously thanked him too enthusiastically because he gave me another one. But he did give me the great gift of his Polish family. And if you've read The Lost Child, you will know that my family background needed a lot of healing. And Stan's family, when we went to Poland, embraced me with open arms. We're both having a little cry here, Stan and myself. On that first visit, Poland was still under communist rule, and we were met at the airport by soldiers with machine guns. The whole family were there. I became Susanna, which is a whole lot better than Suzanne. And I learnt to be kissed on 3 cheeks and to be kissed on my hand. we were piled into several little Lada-type Polish cars and drove into Warsaw, and my first impression was everything was grey, black and white. There was one patch of colour, and it was the Marlborough sign on the side of the tram. We were taken to stay with a niece who lived in what looked like a lovely two-storey house on a boulevard where there were embassy houses. And as we went inside, I realised that the house had been, under the communists, had been considered too big for one family, so it had been cut in half. They lived on the lower floor and another family was above, and the garden was cut down the centre. Across the road was a big park called the Fort, and it was where the Germans took off for their bombing expeditions over Warsaw until it was virtually just stubble. Rubble. So without realising it, I think right from that first visit I was imbibing the history of Poland. We went on to Krakow, where Stan's widowed sister-in-law had spent time in Ravensbrück, and not on that visit but a subsequent visit. She gave me all of the detail that is in the chapter in the Tulip Tree about Ravensbrück. We went to Rostov, a previously German town where Stan's sister and her family lived. That town was now in Poland. The borders had been moved yet again. And Lucien's brother is a professor of archaeology at Wrocław University, and he gave me a solidarity badge but warned me not to wear it. That solidarity was seething, if you like, through Poland, and it was only a couple of years after that that the whole of the Berlin Wall came down and the whole of the communist countries began to topple one by one. Stan had two nieces, or a niece and a niece-in-law, who were both dentists, and Stan arrived on that trip and many before carrying a suitcase full of dental products courtesy of Bill Jeans and Jeff Knight. And it was interesting to go back a few years later. Those two women had now established their own practice. The colour of capitalism was everywhere throughout Poland, and the professor of archaeology had discovered an entrepreneurial skill, and he had set up a series of businesses teaching English. And when that became, everyone was onto that, he set up another business, which you would expect in a consumerist society, debt collecting. So he lectured at the university, and very soon we watched Poland transform from people living in tiny communist apartments to having holiday homes, and all of the German cars in the streets and housing developments on the outskirts of the cities, and it was really not a lot of difference compared with how we live. On subsequent visits also, we sailed the Masurian Lakes, a beautiful stretch of water, 1,000 lakes that interconnect in the northeastern part of Poland. One day we pulled ashore, and the relatives took us into a building, and there we were in the wolf's lair, and we stood inside the very building where the bomb had been placed to kill Hitler but had failed. So I was imbibing, I think, this living history. And we took an overnight train to the Northern Riviera on the near Gdansk, and I discovered, on the Baltic near Gdansk, and I discovered that they really did have golden beaches, just like we have in Australia. And here we traced Stan's university, the forest behind where he sewed the sails to escape, the town, the sailing camp that was still there, and the little cove where he sailed out of towards Sweden. And later, when Polish television made a series called Great Escapes, and they filmed Stan both here and paid for us to go back to Poland, I had a brush with one of Poland's literary greats. We both had a brush with one of Poland's literary greats. For a very small country, Poland's only about double the size of Australia. They have a rich literary tradition. 3 Nobel laureates of literature, Czesław Miłosz and Wisław Szymborska, both poets, and recently Olga Tokarczuk. I already knew that Stan had a connection to the famous Joseph Conrad. His uncle's wife was of the family who, when Conrad was made an orphan, his uncle took him in, and that wife was of that family. But for most, it's very hard to call yourself a writer when you haven't had a lot published. Perhaps I was actually working on editing The Lost Child at that stage, and I dared to say I am a writer to the television crew. And the director was married to a Mexican woman, and got very excited because they had a Mexican friend who was married to a famous Polish writer. So they organised a dinner in the hotel where we were staying, and the particular writer is almost a Polish hero, because under communism he escaped to Mexico rather than submit to the Stalinist directions, if you like, whereas Miłosz and Szymborska stayed, and later on, believing that there would be a better society, but once they became aware of Stalin's terrible cruelties, they had a lot to overcome later on when communism ended. So this writer, Sławomir Mrożek, I didn't know when we went to the dinner, but he was a great hero because he'd escaped. In Mexico, he wrote many famous plays. The main one was called The Immigrants. So we turned up, both of us, for dinner. I was a slightly celebrated writer, which didn't sit very comfortably. We went into a private dining room with the whole television crew, and the Mexican wife of the famous writer. A lot of wood panelling, chandeliers, velvet curtains, a long dining table set up beautifully, and at the head of the table was Mrożek. Now he looked a lot like Malcolm Fraser, except he was bigger and more stony-faced. And I was seated on his left as the Australian writer, and his wife on the right, and Stan next to me. And not knowing anything about him, just that he was some kind of writer I was being introduced to, and Stan knowing even less, reached across the table, shook his hand and said, "Good evening, I'm Stanisław Raczynski, who are you?" And Mrożek did not speak one word throughout the dinner. So Stan and I cringe at the thought of having been so abysmally uninformed about Polish literary figures. But I guess I also wonder at my audacity to take on a task of writing anything about Poland. And there were many times that I asked myself, how can I do this? Why am I doing this? I can't do this. Perhaps an outsider does see a familiar world through fresh eyes, and ultimately you will be the judge. But ultimately, as I acknowledge in my book, the Tulip Tree is a love letter to Stan. And I'd like to finish by emphasising that writers are very good liars. We live in very confused worlds, the real one and the imagined one, whatever we're writing at the time. Recently, Stan couldn't remember something about his history, and he asked me, and I waxed lyrical, and then I went, I actually think I made that up. That belongs in the other world. And Stan had a birthday recently where I made the a little birthday speech at him being 89, and he said, I'm 88. I said, no, you're not, Stan, you're 89. And eventually one of the children said, Susie, I think he's 88. No, he's not, he's 89. So you can see where I'm going here. You know what inspired this book and where the detail came from, but don't believe any of it. It's all imagined. And to clarify that even further, and a small spoiler alert for the careful reader, Stan's mother is a very chaste woman, and there is absolutely no question about the legitimacy of Stan's birth. So tonight I send my baby out into the world, and it now belongs to you to write that final draft. And I love this book, I'm very proud of it, so I hope you'll love it too. I think you will. Thank you.
I'm Michael Howard, I'm a publisher at Text, and this is something of a novel occasion for us. Over the last 2 years, the pandemic has been pretty tricky for publishers and booksellers, but in a way it's underlined just how important books are, and we've certainly had more time to read. And it's been a good thing, I think, for us to reflect on the meaning that books bring to our lives and why we read books. So, while we could continue to publish books and continue to read books and buy books, albeit in a sort of constrained way during the pandemic, the one thing we couldn't do was launch them and celebrate their arrival into the world. So, Suzanne, whatever doubts you had about tonight, bless you for all of your energy in helping to make it happen. Maddie, thank you so much for all of your hard work. Penny, you've been thanked a lot, but we can always say thank you again. And Tim for that wonderful launch speech. Thank you so much. It's absolutely fabulous to be able to come out and celebrate the arrival of a book, and never mind that we published it 6 months ago. Timing wasn't great, but it's fantastic that you're here. When a book is published, there's a new thing in the world, and Suzanne, whatever happens in your life, nobody can ever take that away from you. You are a true writer, and we're very lucky that we found you, and we love publishing you, so thank you. I always think that I want, please stay, drink, eat, and be merry. I think I would like to give you some advice, really. I think it is demoralising to leave a book launch without having bought a copy of the book. And if you're going to buy one, I'm sure you can all think of somebody else who might like it as well. So thank you so much for coming. It's just a pleasure to be here for the launch of the Tulip Tree. Thank you.